Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Kari Bingen, and I am the director of the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs aims to foster a deeper understanding of global affairs. Tonight, we're extending that charter a bit further to outer space. The space environment has changed dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. We are so honored to have General Stephen Whiting with us tonight, Commander of U.S. Space Command, to discuss these changes and their implications for national security. We'll have the opportunity to dive into what Space Command does, but I'll say in the most basic terms, and I'll ask him later to explain it, Space Command is responsible for defending our nation's interests in the space domain and providing military space capabilities to our warfighters and their missions across the globe. General Whiting is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy with a degree in aeronautical engineering. He has commanded the 13th Space Warning Squadron, the 614th Air and Space Operations Center, the Joint Space Operations Center, the 21st Space Wing, and the Combined Force Space Component Command and 14th Air Force. What that all really means is that all the experiences that you would want a four-star general to have in this position, operating a range of different satellite systems, launch vehicles, understanding policy at the highest levels, and developing advanced warfighting tactics, General Whiting has. So we will start off today's program with a discussion, after which we will have time for questions from the audience, both here in person and those of us joining online. So please hold your questions until we get to that portion of the program. For those joining virtually, you can go online to the website ccga.live and submit your question, and I'll get those here on stage. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that today's program is on the record, and any views expressed by the speakers and the moderator here at the Council are our own and do not reflect any institutional positions. So with that, we'll get started, and I will say I've been fortunate to know General Whiting for several years now. The last time I heard him speak was maybe a month or so ago there's a really large space conference in Colorado Springs. He started out his remarks with a Spaceballs movie reference. So we'll see what he starts out with tonight. But General Whiting, so let's start with just general space trends. I mean, space is now routinely in the headlines. SpaceX, Starlink, startups, venture capital. What are some of the most significant trends or changes that you've really seen just in the last 5 to 10 years? And what's most exciting to you about space right now?
Yeah, thanks, Kari, and I really appreciate you doing this. And I want to thank the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for the invitation to be here. I've never been to downtown Chicago before, and it's such a privilege to get to see it and be here. And I recognize we're right on the cusp of Memorial Day weekend, and we want to remember all those Americans who have paid the ultimate sacrifice for our nation this weekend. So you ask what's happening in space, and for me, over the last 10 to 15 years, it's really the fact that U.S. commercial space industry is now the driving force of all the innovation and activity we're seeing in space. If you go back to the founding of the space age, October 4th of 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. It was all about great power competition. The Soviet government launched the first object into space, the first animal, the first man, the first woman. And the United States felt like we were behind and we were losing, and so we created NASA. We designated the United States Air Force as the lead for space inside the Department of Defense. We started investing in science, technology, engineering, and math. Eventually, the United States won that space race when Neil Armstrong walked out onto the lunar surface in 1969. But it was all about governments. Now, over the decades, we started to see commercial industry. We had commercial satellite communications. We had TV services being provided from space, radio services being provided from space. But now, probably a majority of the investments at multiple times are now coming from commercial industry. And so we've seen innovations like rockets that can land themselves. If we went back 10 years ago today, May of 2015, if we were going to talk about rockets that could land themselves, that would seem like crazy talk. And now we have a company that's done that 450 times. And other companies have either done it for suborbital launches or are working it for their own rockets now as well. If we had talked about constellations of satellites that had 7,000 plus satellites that could provide services anywhere on the globe, like broadband internet, we might have thought that was crazy, but now we take that for granted and we can leverage those capabilities. So commercial industry is really what has driven innovation over the last 10 to 15 years. And then the other area that doesn't make me happy are the threats that we've seen, and we'll probably talk more about that. But other countries like China and Russia have carefully watched the United States. They understand why space is important to us, and they have built a range of capabilities to try to deny us use of our space systems.
Well, and on that note, space is now so integral to everything we do in our daily lives in society for what the military does every day. It is, I guess, not a surprise that our adversaries would seek to threaten those capabilities. So I'll mention, we at Center for Strategic and International Studies, we put out an annual non-classified space threat assessment. I figured I had to promote that while I'm here. But you have access to all of the information. So what are some of the key space threat trends that you are seeing, and what's most concerning to you right now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And maybe I can back up just one layer and talk about why space is so important to our nation. Because, space starts at 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface, about 62 miles up, and then extends out from there. And we don't see satellites each and every day. They're kind of out of sight, out of mind, but they impact all of our ways of life, this modern way of life that we enjoy in the year 2025. In a city like Chicago, that's a major financial center, our financial markets are enabled by space. And you say, well, what does that mean? The GPS constellation that we're also used to using to navigate from point A to point B, it provides a global timing signal that synchronizes global stock markets, that synchronizes point of sale purchase locations, like when we pull out that credit card and swipe it at a gas station or a convenience store. And of course, it enables services for us like broadband internet and TV. But on the national defense side, we can't defend our country without the space capabilities that we now rely on. Things like intelligence, things like missile warning. You say, well, what's missile warning? Well, those are the satellites that watch constantly around the globe for a launch of any missile, and then we can assess whether that's going to be a threat to the United States. Satellite communications, GPS, all of these things are foundational to how our nation defends itself. And China and Russia have carefully watched that since the Gulf War in 1990, 1991, and they have built capabilities to hold those satellite systems at risk. And so those are things such as cyber capabilities that could attack us in the cyber domain. It's jammers to jam global positioning system or satellite communications. It's high energy lasers. It's direct ascent anti-satellite rockets that launch from here on Earth and then can hit a satellite in space. In fact, both Russia and China have tested those weapons against their own satellites and created thousands of pieces of debris that we have to deal with. It also includes other satellites that can attack satellites. We call those co-orbital anti-satellite weapons. And then the Russians, over the last year, we've seen reports that they're considering placing a nuclear weapon in space to hold at risk our satellite systems, which would be an incredibly irresponsible action. So the range of threats is real. They're not future possibilities. These are realities that we have to deal with now in space each and every day.
And those threats to satellites, obviously would affect our military operations, but for the business, financial community here that you highlighted, what does that mean for, I guess, our everyday American, for what we do day to day in our lives?
Yeah, in the United States, the federal government has defined 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And all of those are undergirded by access to space capabilities. Imagine if we could for a moment, what it would mean if all of a sudden we lost GPS. Now, I like to joke that when I grew up, my parents had to worry about as a teenager if I was out at night, hey, did I know where I was going? If something happened, could I call to get in touch? If the car broke down, could I get a hold of someone? Today, we don't worry about that anymore because we know our teenagers can just punch in an address and it's going to take them right there. In fact, the only thing we worry about these days with our teenagers and phones is once they become adults, when are they going to get off our cell phone plan? I'm still working with my adult children on that. But it's conveniences like that. But things like 911 call centers that can dispatch police right to where you are, based on providing or the address just coming through the phone, and then they dispatch and we know exactly where to go. It's all of those kind of things that we just take for granted that would be at risk if we lost our space capabilities.
And so given these growing threats and the importance of space overall to our national security, almost 6 years ago now, the U.S. Space Force was established and U.S. Space Command, which is what you lead, was established. Can you then explain a bit further, why were they both needed? What do they do? But also, how are they different? We were talking earlier, there's folks even in DC that conflate the two. So what are the two and how are they different?
Yeah, so in the U.S. military system, the foundation of that system are the military services, the United States Army, the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, United States Air Force, the Coast Guard, and then as of 5.5 years ago now, the United States Space Force. The armed forces, the services are responsible for recruiting the force, they train the force, they equip the force, and then they prepare the force, and then they turn it over to a second set of organizations that are known as combatant commands. Now that's the command I have the privilege to lead. U.S. Space Command is one of those 11 combatant commands. And by law, the combatant commands are responsible for leading U.S. military operations. And we are joint organizations. That means we are composed of members of all the military services. Now, the combatant commands that many people may have heard of before are like U.S. Central Command or CENTCOM, who leads all military operations in the Middle East, or U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, who leads U.S. military operations in the Pacific AOR. Well, U.S. Space Command is responsible for leading operations in the space AOR. So that's starting at 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface and extending from there. So U.S. Space Force, the service, and I am a guardian, a very proud guardian, trains the force, recruits the force, buys most of the space equipment, and then prepares that force and then turns it over to me. And then I take those forces along with the space capabilities of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force. And then I lead and my command, we lead those military operations in space. So it's exactly how our military is designed, to have a set of organizations of services that prepares the force, presents the force, trains the force, and then another set of organizations who all we think about is operations and being prepared if our nation were to go to war.
Well, and it's interesting, I remember when some of the debates were happening on creating a U.S. Space Command and a Space Force is, like Indo-Pacific, that's a place. The Middle East, CENTCOM, is a place. Space is a place as well. So, can you envision a day when we are warfighting in space? Is that day here?
Yes. So, we don't want a war to start in space or to extend into space. However, we've got to be ready for that potential reality. And the goal is, by being ready for that we can deter such a conflict from happening. Because as we talked about, if there were to be a war in space, the United States, that would be a very bad day for the United States. But we must be prepared to win if such a day arises. And so we have to be prepared to do all the things that military forces have to do in space. That is, we have to be able to create intelligence. We have to be able to command and control our forces. We have to be able to conduct offensive and defensive actions. We have to be able to maneuver. We have to be able to integrate with all the other elements of the U.S. military and the U.S. government, including our allies. And so that's what we do each and every day is we plan for that eventuality with the goal of deterring that from ever happening.
And is there an urgency now as opposed to even a couple of years ago to prepare for that eventuality or to deter that?
Yeah, absolutely, Kari. The General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has told his forces, the People's Liberation Army, that they need to be ready by 2027 to militarily reunite Taiwan with the People's Republic of China. So that's not a date, that's not a prediction date of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but we need to take Xi Jinping seriously. If he's told his forces to be ready by 2027, we need to make sure we are equally ready. And China has ambitions to be the world's greatest space power. We've seen the capabilities they've developed to hold at risk our space systems, which I talked about, but they've also built their own space capabilities to make the People's Liberation Army, Air Force, and Navy more precise, more lethal, and more far-ranging. So we if there were to be a conflict with China, we have to be prepared in space. So that date that Xi Jinping has given the People's Liberation Army, I think, has intensified, the need to be ready here in the immediate future.
And to your earlier point, the objective of a strong, ready military, it is deterrence. It's to deter the war, but in order to deter, you need to have that capability. Your forces need to be ready, and Xi Jinping needs to wake up every day thinking, I don't want to take on the United States today, not today. So Can you discuss a bit more as you think about deterrence in space and with the threats that you've laid out? What is Space Command doing, maybe a bit in further detail, to protect our systems from potential disruption or attack? And how are you posturing to prepare and to continue to deter?
Yeah, in federal law, it actually says what the primary duties of the combatant commanders are. So for all 11 of us, it says our number one responsibility is to plan for the employment of the armed forces. So that means each and every day at Headquarters U.S. Space Command, we are focused on planning for potential conflict in space to be ready. The second primary duty is to take actions to deter conflict. So each and every day we do something that we call campaigning, which is linking together operations that we can conduct in space, activities that we conduct maybe with partners or with other stakeholders, and then investments that we and others can make that promote deterrence. And then the third primary duty is to command the armed forces that we've been assigned by the President and the Secretary of Defense. And so we do that each and every day with a goal of deterrence. And there's a number of key partners that help us in that. There's other parts of the U.S. federal government, such as the intelligence community, but there's also key allies and partners. Our closest allies being, of course, in no particular order, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany. And we have relationships with all of those countries where we operate together in space each and every day to promote shared understanding, but to also help others, opponents, potential adversaries, understand that it's unlikely they would be taking on any one of us at a time, because we believe we're all stronger together. As our Secretary of Defense has said, America first does not mean America alone, and we have to have those robust partners.
And I want to come back to allies and partners, but I thought I'd hit something that's been in the news this week, the Golden Dome. The president earlier this week announced that he had selected a missile defense architecture for Golden Dome. Can you explain a bit further what Golden Dome is, what the rationale is, and perhaps the role that space will play in that Golden Dome missile defense architecture?
Yeah, for decades now, the most existential threat to the United States has been a weapon of mass destruction, like a nuclear weapon, paired with an intercontinental ballistic missile. Over the last, several years and decade, we've seen that threat evolve. So traditionally, intercontinental ballistic missile launches, it's on a parabolic trajectory. You can very carefully see where it launched, and you can predict where it's going to hit. Well, now countries like China and Russia have fielded what we call hyperglide vehicles, maneuvering vehicles. So instead of launching and being very predictable, these things now can turn wildly. They can fly much longer than expected. In fact, China, a couple of years ago, tested what we call a fractional orbital bombardment system. So this is a intercontinental ballistic missile that, instead of launching and then coming back to Earth, goes into orbit. And it can do part of an orbit, a fractional orbit, or it can do multiple orbits. And then immediately it could, in theory, it could then deorbit its weapon right on top of a target, and there'd be very little warning. It's a very destabilizing type weapon. Well, these are the threats we now face. And so President Trump, in his executive order on the Golden Dome, says that we need to build a defense system against that. And it even calls out in that executive order the role that space would play. If you want to try to maintain track of those kind of threats that start on Earth, they launch, they go into space, you've got to track them, and then you've got to track them as they're potentially coming in to hit a target, you're really only going to be able to do that from space. So you have to have a robust space tracking layer. And then the president's executive order called for space-based interceptors as well to augment our ground-based interceptors that we have today that conduct missile defense against rogue nations or against theater-class missiles like we've seen in the Middle East over the last couple of years.
And it's less science fiction than maybe it once was when you think about if we had to deploy thousands of interceptors. Our commercial sector builds thousands of satellites now. They launch every week or so. So some of maybe the technology that wasn't there when Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars, that technology has progressed quite a bit in the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, over the last 40 years, President Reagan, I think it was around 1983 that he first talked about his Strategic Defense Initiative. Yeah, as you just said, the technology has advanced tremendously, and then the cost of getting things to orbit has come significantly down as well, again, because of U.S. commercial industry and their space lift and heavy lift capability. So those are all advantages, I think, that will definitely support the development of the Golden Dome.
Okay, that's a great point. Can I shift a bit as well to Ukraine? Space has played a key role in Ukraine, from commercial imagery that showed the buildup of Russian forces prior to their invasion, as they were invading Ukraine. Starlink has provided battlefield connectivity. What lessons are you taking from Ukraine, specifically for space, and perhaps what insights are we getting on the future, what the future of warfare would look like?
Yeah, even in your question, you highlighted the role of commercial, and I think that is the number one lesson. That a country that did not have a lot of its own space capabilities, Ukraine, is able to now field a space-enabled military because of the capabilities they can get from the commercial market. That's everything from imagery of potential target locations or enemy field positions, other types of intelligence like synthetic aperture radar, sensing of electromagnetic interference that the Russians might be trying to use to defeat Ukrainian systems, satellite communications. And so the Ukrainians have been able to get that, and we've been able to support them with those kind of capabilities. So I think the U.S. should expect that in all of our future conflicts, that any opponent we have probably has access to space capabilities, even if they're not a space power themselves. And we have to understand what that means, that the battlefield has become transparent in many ways. We should expect that others will be able to see us and watch us. So what does that mean for us? We've got to think through that carefully. The second lesson I would say is the importance of cyber. So you may recall on the opening night of that war, the Russians conducted a cyber attack against a commercial SATCOM company. And they ended up knocking off the air tens of thousands of SATCOM modems. Those modems are how people used the satellites, and some of those were in businesses, some of them were in wind generators that created power. They were all over Europe, and the Russians did an attack because they were trying to knock the Ukrainians off the satellite communications, but it bled over. So the lesson of that is others will try to attack your space capabilities using cyber. So you've got to harden yourself against that. Yes, Russia could try to attack us in the space domain, as could China, but it would be cheaper for them to attack us in cyber and harder for us to attribute. So we've got to harden ourselves there. And then maybe the third thing I'll highlight is on the modern battlefield, if you don't have space-enabled capabilities, you're not going to be successful. And we've seen that time and time again in the Ukrainian conflict, whether that's drones that are leveraging GPS or other position navigation and timing signals, satellite communications to keep your country linked together. Your government, your forces have to be space enabled, or you just won't succeed on the modern battlefield.
And one of your first observations that you just highlighted is our adversaries will use space against us and use imagery to target our forces on the ground, see our movements, et cetera. It's been interesting in Washington seeing that concern expressed, but the implication being the United States now has to figure out, how do we deny our adversaries that ability to see our forces on the ground and leverage space to their advantage? It's changing the discussion a bit. So I don't know if you have some thoughts on that or comments on that of what that means for us.
Yeah, it's something we definitely have to pay attention to. So China, for example, has built a system using hundreds of intelligence satellites designed to find, fix, track, and target U.S. forces if we were to have a conflict. And they want to find our forces as close to the United States as we can. If you can imagine Navy ships steaming west out of the West Coast toward Hawaii, and then on toward the second island chain, first island chain, and then up to the Asian coast. And the Chinese have built that system, and that system is designed to enable over-the-horizon long-range fires to hold at risk U.S. and allied forces. So we've got to carefully think through that problem and be prepared to operate in the face of that threat now, because that is the world in which we live.
And policymakers are now talking more publicly about, we in the United States need to figure out how we deny that capability to our adversaries, which leads us down the path of fielding our own space weapons capabilities.
Yeah, as we saw in the Golden Dome executive order, where the president called for space-based interceptors, space provides us an opportunity to act there if called upon, and in the case that you just highlighted, we do need capabilities that protect us against the space-enabled attack of others, whether that occurs in space or here on planet Earth. That's an important part of the work that we do at U.S. Space Command each and every day.
Yeah, that's a great point. You also mentioned a lesson learned being commercial and seeing how much commercial contributed to the battlefield on Ukraine. We are seeing an incredible expansion of innovative commercial companies. So not just SpaceX, but several others. We're seeing the commercialization of areas of space that heretofore maybe only governments did. I want to connect this to Chicago here. There was a fantastic startup that came out of the University of Chicago where I'm going to give them a shout out here, Stellatus, Holly Heifel, and Kishan Raghunath. They developed a collision avoidance system for space to make sure satellites didn't run into each other. And it got incorporated or acquired by a commercial space company called Slingshot Aerospace, doing commercial space situational awareness. But there's so much activity happening now in the commercial sector. How do you stay on top of that? How do you leverage and integrate it into the missions that you have?
At U.S. Space Command, we are not an acquisition organization, so we don't design satellites, we don't buy satellites. However, it is vital that we continually scan the developments in commercial space industry so that we can highlight exciting new technologies that we think could be beneficial to our missions, and then working with people like the Space Force, who have that responsibility of equipping the force, or others that also do that kind of work in the intelligence community. We try to make sure they're aware of those new developments. And then once those new developments are ready and are being purchased and new innovations are being purchased or brought in, then we want to incorporate them as quickly as possible. And then we do have a role helping to defend U.S. commercial industry against the threats that I just talked about. So you can imagine, we work with U.S. commercial industry. We contract with them for example, satellite communications bandwidth. They're subject to the same threats that our military satellites have. And so if we are contracting with those companies, we want to help defend them. And so we have ways that we share threat information with them, and so they can best understand the environment in which they're operating. And sometimes they're the first to understand a threat. So we've seen examples where satellite communications companies that we work with will come and say, hey, I'm getting jamming over this part of the world, and that'll be the first heard for us. And that helps us then tailor our intelligence responses to really understand what's going on there.
Well, and then as the operator or the employer of space capabilities and the command that is setting requirements for what you need out of the community, what are those key capabilities and needs that you would maybe message here to industry, to these startups being incubated at University of Chicago and elsewhere? What do you need out of them?
Yeah, and I'm going to get to visit University of Chicago tomorrow. They've got a long history in space with Carl Sagan's a graduate, Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble Space Telescope's named after. So very excited about that. First, our nation has invested a lot into space over the years, and we are the world's greatest space power. But we're asking our Department of Defense space community to do a lot in the face of these threats right now. We have to be able to continue to support the nation and the joint force with the space capabilities they've grown accustomed to. In fact, the other services, the other parts of the U.S. military could not fight the way they are designed to fight today without space. That's how important it is. In fact, I call it a moral responsibility that we continue to support them that way. The second thing that we have to do is we have to protect and defend our satellites against the threats that we now see in the domain. And I've talked a little bit about that. And then third, we have to help protect the nation and our joint forces, all the other military forces in the United States, from those space-enabled attacks that I talked about. And then finally, we've got to train and test and make sure that all of this stuff's going to work if we do get into a fight. So the nation has invested a lot. I think we're going to need to invest more in space as we go forward. It's only about 3.5% of the DoD budget, and we're going to need to invest more going forward. But the specific capabilities, I actually have a formal way of communicating this to the Congress and to the Pentagon and to commercial industry. But the top three things, maybe the top four things on that list, number one is I need what we call integrated space fires. And those are the capabilities to protect and defend our systems and to hold at risk space capabilities that are threatening the United States. The second area is I need improved command and control capabilities. So these are the systems that enable us to synchronize and integrate all of the services, military capabilities, our allies' military capabilities, commercial capabilities, and to bring all of that to bear in a unified manner. And then the third area is I need space domain awareness. We have the best space domain awareness in the world. That means tracking all these things in space, maintaining custody of threats, knowing what's happening in space. However, the threats are scaling at such a fast pace that we have to improve that space domain awareness. And then the last area would be cyber defenses. And I've already talked about the importance of cyber. There's more on that list, but those are the top four.
And let me come back to a point you made earlier, which was on allies and partners. Space Command has emphasized the importance of working with our allies and partners in policy circles, and I'll channel the DC Beltway person that I am, but in policy circles, we're now talking more about burden sharing among our allies, wanting our allies to do more, investing more in defense. So what does that look like in space? And I guess, what do you need out of our allies and partners in space, but also what are some of the unique capabilities that they bring to the table that maybe we don't have, or maybe we have not prioritized or could.
Yeah, we have a number of relationships with countries all over the world, and that starts at a basic level. Maybe we just share information. If one of their satellites is having a problem, we can track it with our systems and share with them what we're seeing. At the next level up, we do some exercises together of how do we track objects on orbit. Maybe you may have read just recently, there was a Soviet, I think it was a Soviet probe that went to Venus that was coming back last week, and it was going to burn back in the atmosphere. So we'll work with them on how do we track that together and share that information. But at the highest level is a named operation in space. So what do I mean by that? You may recall Operation Desert Storm. That was a named operation where the United States and our allies, expelled Iraq from Kuwait. Well, we have a named operation in space, Operation Olympic Defender. That's us plus Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, France, and Germany, where we're operating together in space each and every day. And based on individual relationships we have with those countries, I think we get three primary benefits. And of course, we're doing our part. We want to make sure they're doing their part as well. In some cases, they are providing capability that they have bought and paid for, and then we get access to that. So for example, the Canadians have built a space domain awareness tracking satellite. So this is a satellite in orbit that tracks other satellites, and then we get that information as part of this agreement that we have with Canada. Secondly, some of these countries have fantastic geography that we can then partner and build capability in their country that we can share costs on, share manning of. So we have capability in Australia, for example, a different part of the world, a different hemisphere that gives us a unique vantage point onto space. And so we partner with them. We partner with the UK for unique geography that the Brits have. And then the third way is we have agreements with some of these countries where we actually man units together. So if you were to come to our unit in Colorado that tracks every missile launch around the world using our satellites, and you were to walk onto this really awesome operations floor that we have there that maintains constant awareness of these threats, it might be a Canadian captain who is running the show that day with an American NCO, or vice versa. It might be an Australian, because those countries have sent people to help us do this mission because we're partnered in it together. Now, these countries are also investing more in space. So we think in the coming next few years that we will see them develop more of their own independent systems. But we want to do that in a way that we all are stronger together as we develop new capability because of these rich partnerships that we have.
Well, it's been fascinating to see. I've had the chance to go to Japan several times in the last couple of years. They are putting a lot more resource and emphasis on space, expanding their space capability. NATO, our European allies, are putting a lot more into space. So there is a greater opportunity here to add to our capacity. All commanders always want more than what exists. So greater opportunity to add to capacity, be a force multiplier, but also to bring complementary capabilities to the table to complement what the U.S. is doing in space as well. Also on the international front, the United States has the most satellites in space. Most of ours are commercial. The Chinese, maybe number 2 in terms of the most number of satellites. you mentioned earlier is with some of these anti-satellite missile tests, it's created a lot of debris. How are we thinking about, what does responsible behavior look like in space? What do norms of behavior look like in space? And how do we even have that conversation with China, number two country in space right now, and really catching up?
Yeah, there is some space law or some international law that governs space, but not a ton. In fact, maybe the principal treaty is called the Outer Space Treaty. It was signed in 1967. That's the year I was born, and it has some fundamental requirements there or agreements that we have signed up to, the Russians, the Chinese have signed up to, such as no country can claim sovereignty over a celestial body. So that means nobody can claim the moon for themselves. It also says things like countries are responsible for satellites that are launched from either their country or their companies. And if one of those satellites were to re-enter and damage or injure or kill someone, that country's responsible for making that right. You may recall in the late 1970s, a Soviet satellite that had a nuclear propulsion system re-entered and spread across northern Canada, and the Soviets paid to help Canada go in and clean that up. But one of the things that also says, Kari, is that countries cannot put weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons on orbit. And so the idea that the Russians, the original space superpower who put up Sputnik, that they are considering doing this is incredibly irresponsible. So we have to call that out and say that we as the, we in the responsible spacefaring nations, we can't tolerate that. And so hopefully that does not happen. But in the United States, we in our inside of our government, we have established what we call norms of responsible behavior. And many of our allies subscribe to very similar norms. And the idea there is, even though it's not an international treaty, if we are all acting the right way, just kind of like if we're all driving on the interstate the right way, close to the speed limit, putting our turn signal on, getting off and on when we should, well, then those who aren't, it's easier to call them out when they aren't acting the way they should. And so some of those norms of responsible behavior for us are, we're not going to create long-lived debris on orbit like we've seen the Chinese do when they did their ASAT test about 18 years ago, left 3,500 pieces of long-lived debris we're still dealing with.
Yeah, 7 decades or something.
Yes, and the Russians 3 years ago did something very similar. We're not going to create harmful interference that interferes with others' satellites. We're not. We always are going to operate with due regard. We're going to provide public notifications of safety. So you may find this interesting. We actually warn today the Chinese and the Russians, if we predict that one of their satellites is going to hit a piece of debris, we send them a notification. And you may say, well, why are you doing that? Well, because we don't want one of their satellites to hit a piece of debris and create more debris, because now we have to operate in that environment. So we're sending proactive notifications to others. Now, the Chinese, if you follow the space business, they've had some launches in the last couple of years where they've left hundreds of pieces of debris, but they don't call us and tell us that to promote safety. We have to figure that out ourselves with our own space capabilities. So we would like to see them be more proactive on the space safety side, so that we don't have satellites running into debris, so we don't have rockets launching into debris, so we don't have miscalculation or misunderstanding. And so I think there's more that other countries can do to promote that.
Because any collision between our satellites, theirs, anybody else's, to your point, will create debris in orbit, and physics in space is physics. It'll stay up there for a long time. So it really does jeopardize much more than a handful of satellites. It jeopardizes really everyone's use of those orbits.
It does. And if you've seen the movie Gravity with
I knew we'd get a movie.
Yeah, that's right. With Sandra Bullock, that's Hollywood, a little hyperbole, but that opening scene, one satellite hits another and it creates debris, hits more satellites. We want to avoid that. And just so everyone understands, the amount of debris has really gone up recently, or let me say it differently. The number of objects in space have gone up. Since Space Command was created, not quite 6 years ago, that number's gone up 90%. We're tracking about 48,000 objects on orbit right now. Now that's because of the growth of the mega constellations like Starlink, where SpaceX and others now, Amazon is starting to launch its mega constellation, are putting up, every 2 or 3 days, there's another 20 satellites going up. It's also, we have some better sensors now that help us track the objects that were already on orbit, smaller objects that maybe we couldn't track in the past. But then we have seen some irresponsible actions like the Russian ASAT test of November 2021, where they created 1,500 pieces of long-lived debris. Space is becoming more congested, even as it has become more contested.
Well, and to your point on these large constellations, I've been doing some research looking at China's commercial space sector, and it's as if they've said, I see you, Elon and Starlink, and I'm going to raise you. There are no less than 4 or 5 Starlink equivalent constellations that China's building. So I would think it would be in their interest at some point here to come to the table, have a discussion, so we can figure out what those traffic rules look like, so we don't end up in one of these catastrophic situations.
Yeah, discussions on space safety would be in all of our benefits, no doubt.
Well, I'm going to start shifting to audience questions here. I'll ask one question online, but anyone here in the audience that has questions as well in person, there should be a microphone, I think, coming in the middle here. So please encourage you to ask those questions. So first question that was posed here is, how do we ensure that our investments in space aren't quickly antiquated? So, the idea being, the technology, the pace of progress is so fast right now in space, as opposed to, when you were a young major or colonel. Like, how do we stay on top of that? How do we make sure that we continue to maintain advantage?
This is how the U.S. military likes to fight. We like to have technological advantage, and this is truly rocket science. And so we want to strike the right balance of making sure that we have the absolute best technology, cutting-edge technology, world-leading technology for the things we need that for, the military unique things we have to do, while also taking advantage of what U.S. commercial industry can bring. For example, if we can satisfy a lot of our military's satellite communication requirements from what commercial industry brings us, then let's do that, and let's focus our real investment dollars, our research and development on the most important things like making sure the president is constantly connected with his nuclear forces, what we call nuclear command and control. Well, we're not gonna give that to a commercial company. We're gonna build that to our very specific set of requirements. And so it is this balance of leveraging what we can from commercial industry, and then the things that we absolutely must design ourselves for that cutting edge, world-leading capability, then we'll do so. And fortunately, U.S. universities, U.S. laboratories bring us that great technology, and we've got to continue to leverage that at speed.
Oh, great point. Okay, let me turn it to our in-person audience here. If you'll please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
I'm Eric Mao. I'm from the Geopolitical Forum. General Whiting, welcome. Nice, very informative conversation. My question is, last week, a few days ago, I caught I think it was congressional hearing with a Navy secretary and a Marine general and a Navy general. They were focusing on the deindustrialization of the United States and the hollowed out the industrial production capacity, the impact on the Navy, and how they deal with it, how they overcome it in the long term. My question is, you, in your role in Space Command, do you feel there's similar constraints? And also, how do you compare the U.S. capability to build up, to develop in that space operation with nearest rival, China or Russia?
Yeah, thank you for that question. U.S. commercial space industry is not just an advantage for Space Command. It is one of our nation's principal advantages, and it's widening over the rest of the world. And so we want to continue to reinforce that. Now, there is some fragility in that defense industrial base and in that commercial space sector. I've heard for a while now that we're 5 to 10 years away from a big chunk of the workforce retiring. So we want to make sure that we continue to encourage young men and women to come into these career fields. We also have to make sure, not just with the big companies, those historically that have been in space, but the new emerging companies, but down at the subcontractor level, those who are supplying the individual components. We need a robust defense, industrial base there, and we've run into some places where, all the big companies, as they're now going to the subcontractors, all of a sudden for some single component, they're all going to the same company. Well, that's a choke point for us now. We want to make sure that we have multiple companies that can field all the capabilities that we need. So this is I think a world-leading effort for the United States and our commercial space companies, but there are some areas that we want to continue to invest in to make sure they're as robust and resilient as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, next, please, sir.
I'm Barry Greenman. I'm a new member here. What I would like to say is, do you work with the Commerce Department to make sure that our new technologies aren't inadvertently exported to our adversaries?
Yeah, thank you, sir, for that question. The Commerce Department is a stakeholder with us. Now, they're a regulatory body. We are not a regulatory body, but we do work with them because they're in the process of taking over some of the space track capabilities that we have. And that's today the Space Command and Space Force. We provide information to commercial companies and to academic organizations about what we're tracking in space. The Department of Commerce is going to take that over here in the next couple of years. So we're working with them on that. But maybe where we work most closely to what you're asking about, sir, is we do have partnerships to help increase the cybersecurity of our commercial space companies so that their intellectual property isn't stolen by other countries. And of course, if you've followed that in the media, we know that other countries have routinely tried to use cyber as a way to steal intellectual property, and then we'll see them replicating the capabilities that we've very smart people have invested a lot of money into develop, and now they're getting that for free. So that's how we work across the government to try to secure those technologies.
And that's a challenge, is how do you balance working with our close allies on advanced space technology, because there's a lot that they can bring to the table, but at the same time protect that technology and ensure it doesn't end up in the hands of the Chinese who would use it against us. And so you're constantly trying to strike that balance, I imagine.
Exactly. And in fact, I think the president had an executive order on that very topic about, with those allies that we have, the trusted security relationships where we know they can, keep our secrets and we can keep their secrets. I think the president's directed that there be more work done to make sure that we can share technology in the space sector and other sectors with those partners, while ensuring those other countries who can't do that don't receive that technology.
Yes, sir.
General, thank you for your discussion. It was most inspiring. Your opportunities and challenges in space are limitless. And I just wanted to make a comment as to the roots of the U.S. and the Soviet space program. Both came from Germany with Wernher von Braun. He developed the B-2 bomb, and the U.S. he surrendered to the Americans. Okay, and in 1944 he was making presentations to Herr Hitler about his rocketry. And 10 years later, he was in Tomorrowland and Disneyland making similar presentations about going to Mars. That's one. On the Russian side, I'm sure you're familiar with Sergei Korolev, who was put in prison. There's one more comment. I know before I get the gong, just a couple of minutes. Gong. I just want to make a comment. Sergei Korolev was the developer of Sputnik, and he developed the Yuri Gagarin as the first man to orbit the Earth. Okay, and he was put in prison by Stalin during the war. And when you go to his museum in Samara, you see the barbed wire.
Because I'm gonna take the opportunity to turn it into a question.
The point is, it came from the same roots almost. Okay, the German scientists is a fundamental point. Is where it came from in the most recently in the 40s, but starting in the 20s.
Okay, so I'm gonna thank you, sir. I'm gonna shift here to the audience. the online audience. So following the Golden Dome announcement this week, China condemned the actions as the U.S. militarizing space. I want to get your reaction to that and maybe give us a bit of a history lesson here on the militarization of space.
You know, it's fascinating when the Chinese or the Russians talk about concerns with militarization of space. When I look up and I see their on-orbit anti-satellite weapons, when I see their direct ascent anti-satellite rockets, when I see their high-energy lasers, when I see their jammers, you know, China has been studying us for 35 years. In 2007, they tested a direct ascent ASAT missile to show us that they could hold us at risk. So, you know, China is well down this path, and you know, their hypocrisy is evident for all to see.
Yeah, and you know, back to the militarization of space. I mean, Sputnik. This gentleman mentioned it. You mentioned it in the outset, 1957. And that was a military or government satellite. Yeah. So it's been space has been militarized from the outset.
Yeah, we've gone to space for military purposes since, you know, really the 1960s. And of course, we don't want there to be a war in space. We don't want a war to extend into space. But as I think George Washington said, the best way to avoid war is to be prepared for it. And so that's where we find ourselves.
All right, sir. The floor is yours.
You mentioned earlier that the U.S. advantage in space is increasing. If I'm not mistaken, you also mentioned that choke points could give some sort of vulnerability. In your view, does U.S. reliance on a single company, SpaceX, present any sort of disadvantages or choke points in U.S. capabilities?
Yeah, you know, what we want is there to be competitive markets in all of these, capabilities. So we want there to be multiple companies who can provide these kind of systems. And so, for example, we just have seen Amazon start launching their Kuiper communications proliferated low Earth orbit system. And so from our perspective, we want there to be a robust commercial market. We have multiple vendors to go to, but we don't want to achieve that by restraining the companies that have done exactly what we've hoped for, which is to disrupt a market, come with new price points, with innovation, because that's fantastic for us as a nation. It's fantastic for our national defense. So I don't think it's a vulnerability. We just want there to be multiple companies doing these kind of things. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And then, yeah.
My question has to do with the commercialization and militarization combined. So you have a national security strategy which relies on this very strong partnership between commercial providers and military users. And so as you militarize space incrementally, as you pointed out, it's always been militarized. Now you have a commercial partner that is a military partner as well. And you talked about the fragility of the commercial market, and you just talked a little bit about needing to have a variety of sources across all these modalities of collection and so forth. How worried are you about the fragility of the commercial capabilities? Because commercial providers aren't making a lot of money. You're seeing mergers, acquisitions that are losing money for the venture capitalists who are involved in it. And so the market for commercial space is not overwhelmingly healthy, let's suggest. So now you're tied into a commercial market as a military client.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you know, this could be a whole hour discussion, you know, just on this topic. Last year, the Defense Department came out with a commercial integration strategy for space, and it had a few different priorities, if you will. One of them was balance, and the idea is, you know, where are the places that we can leverage leverage commercial capabilities in space? And so we've defined many of those, and we use those regularly. And then there's other areas that we're going to say, no, we have to control those systems and own those systems. But my experience has been the commercial space companies that we do contract with today, they are all fantastic partners. They've all lived up to their contracts. They all seem eager to want to continue to contract with us going forward. We do want the entire space defense industrial base to be healthy. We continue to see startups that are coming to the market with their ideas and their products. So we want to leverage commercial where we can, and then in the places we need to have our own dedicated owned systems, we will do that. And we think there's more opportunity on the commercial side.
Okay, our
Thank
time
you.
is winding down. I'm going to convert to speed round. So if the next three gentlemen want to each ask a quick question, and then I'm going to bundle it and give it to General Whiting to answer.
Yeah,
So
thank
sir,
you.
go ahead.
Very quickly, along the same lines of the commercial infrastructure in space, like Starlink, there are cases where those companies may not have their interests and motivations perfectly aligned with the United States, or more particularly, I think, our allies.
Okay.
How do we leverage them?
So alignment of commercial interests. Next, sir, we're going to go one more person after you.
Hey, General, thanks so much for being here. BAMA student at University of Chicago. Quickly, for China, was curious about your understanding of the new aerospace forces and how this new organizational structure works in comparison to past strategic support force developments in space.
Okay, and then last question.
All right. First, just thanks for being here. I'm the CEO of Spider Oak, one of the very few companies focused on space cyber. And your quote on being the cyber being the soft underbelly is a rallying cry for us. How do you think of Golden Dome as part of the overall JADC2 vision?
All right. So very fast, and I apologize. I will not do credence to all those questions. But how do we remain aligned, or how do we make sure we get what we need from commercial? We got to write good contracts that they understand what they are being asked to do, that we have written down clearly what we need them to do, and then that we hold commercial companies to account. And by and large, again, I mean, overwhelmingly, the commercial space companies have done exactly what we've asked them, and I expect that they'll continue to do that. On the Chinese, I won't go into the complete reorganization. The gentleman who asked the question understands it. China had combined their space and cyber and information forces under one headquarters. They've disestablished that headquarters. What that really does is it now places their space capabilities more directly under the Central Military Commission. So we'll see exactly what that means for them, but they've removed one of their headquarters, and now they have a more direct line to that. And then, a Golden Dome type capability that can provide, defense for this nation against the modern threats that we now see is going to have a global command and control system. Whatever that gets named, it will sound a lot like CJADC2, I think, because that, and again, for those who may not be familiar with that acronym, I won't go through it all now, but it's a global joint combined command and control system that enables the entire military to operate together across the globe. And we're going to need something like that for Golden Dome.
Wow, General, you hit all three. Let me take the moderator's prerogative and ask you one more question, and we'll end on that because I can weave in somebody from our online audience. Crystal ball here, the next 10 years. What do the next 10 years look like in American space power? What does Space Command's mission look like? And from the audience here, what are you most proud about that sets U.S. Space Command apart from other commands?
Wow, there's a lot in that.
Yeah.
I am proud to show up and work each and every day. And I know you all as American citizens would be proud of the young men and women I get to serve with from all of our armed forces who show up each and every day to defend American interests in space and make sure that we can continue to leverage that for all of us. I'm always humble about trying to predict the future because 10 years ago, the command I lead didn't exist. The service I serve in didn't exist. We had never landed a rocket. So the world can change a lot in 10 years. But I think in 10 years, we will have seen humanity back on the moon, led by NASA through the Artemis program. We will, I think, maybe have seen humans on Mars. There might be the beginning of a Mars colony. Humans might be leveraging the resources of the moon and asteroids to improve our lives here. And if Karl Clausewitz was right, now he's the great Prussian military theorist who said that warfare is politics by other means. As humanity goes out into the stars, unless we've evolved as a species, that says at some point we're going to need a defense force. And we're going to have to be able to defend our interests there. Because as humans interact, unfortunately, human history says warfare and conflict has ensued. And so U.S. Space Command will be leading those military operations on behalf of the nation, if that's how the future unfolds. I hope maybe we've evolved where that won't happen, but so far human history says we need to be ready to defend our interests.
Well, and General, one of my big takeaways from this conversation, and just to emphasize everything you've said tonight, is just the importance of space to our national security, to our economic security, to the overall vitality of America and our interests, that is a huge takeaway. There are tremendous opportunities in space right now, also challenges as you've highlighted with the threat. And you mentioned that the budget will inevitably need to grow for space. I'll just cite, I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison here, but the Air Force, which you are paired with under the Department of the Air Force, their budget is 8 times bigger than the Space Force. The next largest service is the Marine Corps, so the Space Force is 18 times smaller than the Marine Corps. And just given the array of challenges that you highlighted, the commercial innovation that we have to leverage, I mean, it is inevitable that this space area will have to grow. So I won't necessarily say it has to grow 18 times, but it is an area that we'll have to look for to look for growth going into the future. Sir, I want to thank you so much for your leadership at Space Command and all that you've done in our national security space community, the insights that you've shared with us tonight. And it was a real privilege to take the Chicago Council on Global Affairs up to space this evening. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you.